to whether it's Laura, Taylor, or Osler, and they're going to hit it off this morning with their Battle of the Belt, corn versus soybeans.
Thanks, Ryan. I'm gonna tee it off and then I'll pass it on to the others. But it's always good to be here. I appreciate the invitation to talk about Battle for the Belt. Of course, you guys are well aware this is probably my most favorite extension project ever. So excited to be here. So Battle for the Belt is a project we've been working on for 2 years now. We'll have our third growing season in 2025 this year. And really, it's to help answer the question, what crop should we prioritize planting in the spring, corn or soybeans? So we know that planting date is extremely important for both crops. And so for soybean, we have seen a half a bushel per acre per day loss in yield for each day we plant after the end of April. The issue is that corn planting dates are also really important, and Osler has seen close to 2 bushels per acre per day loss in yield for each day planting after the end of April. So we know both crops need timely planting or yields will be really limited. So when we talk about these at extension meetings, a lot of times farmers will have the question, what crop do I plant first, since planting date is important for both. And if you only have one planter, you may have limitations in that area. The issue is our planting window is also very small in Ohio. So these pictures here are not uncommon to what you'll see across the state. Almost every year in Ohio, we have these wet conditions. So our planting window is really small. And the bad news is that our planting window is getting smaller each year. Kansas State University tracks suitable field work days. And since 1995, only about half of the days in between April 17th and May 15th have been suitable for field work. So this is not only planting, but this is any herbicide application, fertilizer application, tillage that you may want to do. You only have about half of those days available to do field work. And the bad news is that the trend is becoming fewer and fewer suitable work days each year. So that's going to force farmers to maybe plant earlier than what they would like or later than what they would like because that window is so incredibly small. Crop insurance dates are also important to keep in mind, and the early crop insurance dates for soybeans were revised about 2 years ago, and this is done by soybean agronomists across the U.S. We petitioned USDA RMA to change these dates, which in Ohio means farmers can now plant soybeans about 10 days earlier and still have crop insurance coverage. But now what we see is these insurance dates are overlapping with corn. So these optimum planting dates are very similar. So what crop should we plant first, corn or soybean? And that's our underlying question, but there's also other questions we can look at with this project. First of all, which crop has the smallest yield penalty for delayed planting? Can we adjust management practices to mitigate losses due to late planting? And then planting date interacts with all kinds of other factors throughout the growing season. So we're able to look at how planting date influences insects, disease, weeds, and a lot of other factors. So I'm going to hand it off to Osler to talk about our actual study.
Can you hear me okay? Yes, excellent. Thank you, Laura, for that introduction. It's also my pleasure to be here one more time, Corn Soybean School 2025. Osler Ortez, corn agronomist at Ohio State, and Laura, Taylor, and myself, we have been intensively working on this project along with others in our college in the past couple of years, and we are looking for our final year in 2025. I will also make the note here. There are also exciting new opportunities that are spinning out of this project, and I will try to mention that at the end. The project structure itself, this is what how we started, what you see on the screen. That was in 2023. We have 5 planting windows. We are looking at planting as early as late March to early April across the different locations in Ohio. And we have approximately anywhere 10 days to 20 days intervals between each planting date for a total of 5. The last planting date usually lands sometime in the middle or late June. The 3 research locations are highlighted in that map on the right side of the screen. We are working, this is all on the university farms. We work with our 3 farm managers. At the Western Station, Joe Dowling. At Northwest, we work with Matt Davis. And at Northeast, Worcester, we work with Lynn Alt and the respective teams to get this intensive work out in the field every year. Besides planting dates, when we talk about planting dates, there are also other management factors that we should be thinking about. And of course, you as practitioners, as decision makers, whether you are a farmer, an educator, a crop consultant, you will also be thinking about other management options as we are adjusting our planting dates. And in the case of soybeans, the one that comes high in the rank is seeding rates. So in this experiment, we have those 5 planting dates. These are side-by-side fields. So hopefully there is a very consistent competition there, a fair competition, a fair comparison. We do those fields side-by-side. And on top of the planting date, we are also doing seeding rates for soybeans. We have seeding rates as low as 100,000 seeds per acre, and we have seeding rates as high as 210,000 seeds per acre. We are interested how those seeding rates interact with the different planting dates. Are we better off with a high seeding rate in April, or are we better off with a high seeding rate in June? So we are looking into that. Now, shifting to my favorite crop here, corn. When it comes to corn, we are not talking about seeding rates anymore. Rather, we are looking at relative maturities as a higher priority. Yes, we could be thinking about seeding rates in corn as well, but that will be lower in the rank. And we decided, for the sake of the project, we were only focusing on the relative maturity piece. So for corn, if we are planting early, we might think, well, a full season hybrid, full season maturity should work better. If we are planting clear into June, a shorter maturity might do a better job when it comes to productivity and yield. So we are looking at those 2 interactions in the experiment. And I think this goes back to Laura, and she will start walking us through the results at the West Central location 2024 with a little bit of a comparison to what we saw in 2023. We already have 2 years of results.
Yeah, so I'm going to start with 2024, but I will take a look back at 2023 as well. But 2024, again, we had 5 planting dates. And the first planting date was extremely early. It was March 25th, and that's the earliest that my research program has had soybeans out. So we really appreciate Joe's efforts there on March 25th to get both corn and soybean planted. This is just showing soybean results, but we're looking at yields between March 25th and then about June 17th. If the letters are the same, that means the yields are statistically the same. So our first 4 planting dates statistically all yielded the same. Numerically, March 25th was the highest yield at 74 bushels per acre, but statistically the same as the others. Where we see a big decline in yield is going from the end of May into June, and that's about a 20 bushel per acre yield loss just between those 2 dates. Taylor's going to talk about some of her observations looking at soybean stand.
Yeah, so we have a nice partnership with some ag engineers, and they would fly a drone over our fields mostly once a week for the whole season. So I thought it would be interesting to take some of our drone pictures and show you what our plant stands looked like. So the most obvious one we have depicted here is our first planting date, March 25th, and we'll go through the season a little bit, but those soybeans kind of gotten beat up a lot, especially in the early season. And you can see the stand toll that took in our first planting date. We have a lot of gaps that are seen from that aerial photo, where the rest of our planting dates really had a much more optimal population. Now, our population that we want to have is at least 100, and we are down to 42,000 on March 25th, but we still have the numeric #1 yield from March 25th. And I think it's really amazing how resilient our soybeans are, even at that low of a population.
Yeah, so, and it's interesting when you see these stands that are more even, those are, you know, over 100,000 plants per acre, statistically the same yield, so around that 70 some bushels per acre. And then those empty spots aren't empty, those are June planted soybeans, and those are the ones that yielded about 20 bushels less, even though the plant population was 131,000. Having an earlier planting date is better than maybe a perfect stand. So one thing that we've looked at in terms of early planting as a side project is weed control. So as Taylor mentioned, when we plant really early, there's all kinds of early season stressors that occur, and we see extremely low plant populations, in this case, very low at 42,000 plants per acre. And the issue with early planting is that you have these low plant populations and the soybean plants grow very slowly. And there are other plants that don't grow slowly, and those are weeds. So we have a side project with Alyssa Espin looking at different weed control strategies for early planted soybeans. And this is preliminary data. This is based on 1 year of data at the Western Ag Research Station. We had 2 fields, but 1 year of data. We'll be repeating it this year. But some preliminary observations we've made is that you can't rely on pre-emergence herbicides for season-long control. We did need multiple post applications, 2 post applications to provide weed control throughout the season. Adding residual to the post-emergence herbicide applications were useful to control weeds and maximize soybean yield. Watching your flowering date. This is extremely key and something that I was surprised about. When we planted on March 25th, the soybean plant started flowering on May 28th. So this was much earlier than we had expected, and some of the herbicides you may use in your post application have a cutoff date of flowering. So we had 2 post applications, but they were very early because of that flowering date that came earlier than what we expected. This is my graduate student's name for his Gold Star treatment. So everything had a burn down, and then his Gold Star was an early post, a late post, and that late post had the addition of S-metolachlor as a residual. I'll turn it over to Osler to talk about corn.
Here we go. This is corn at the West Central location 2024. We have those 5 planting dates on the horizontal line, and then we have yield on the vertical line. The different line colors in the graph, they are representing the 4 relative maturities that we tested. We had a 100-day hybrid on dark blue. We had a 107-day hybrid in orange color. We had a 111 in green and a 115-day hybrid in light blue at the top. So those are the 4 relative maturities. We will be presenting in a similar way the results at the other 2 locations. So hopefully we can stick that in our minds for a little while now. As far as results, what we saw in 2024 West Central, the best planting date conditions for maximizing yield were on that 2nd and 3rd planting date. That would have been April 16th or May 6th at the Western Station. That's where you see the A letters getting close to 240 bushels of corn per acre. And in order to get those 240 bushels, of course, it was also influenced by the hybrid that we were selecting. And in this case, our best shot was looking at the full season maturities. In those two planting dates gave us our maximum yield. What is interesting here is that at the bottom of the graph on the dark blue line, you see that the 100-day hybrid did very poorly if it was planted early, which that's something that we should expect. If we are planting early, we have a longer growing season, we should be maximizing yield with a longer relative maturity. Now, on the other end, if we go to the last planting date in June, that same 100-day hybrid in dark blue is the one that is giving us the highest yielding results. So this is all to say there is a clear interaction between the relative maturities for corn and the different planting dates. So relative maturities is something that we should really be watching as we are making planting day decisions in the year. We will turn it over to Taylor. Taylor is out there almost every week at every location through the growing season, so she will help us with some highlights about the season's stressors for corn.
Thanks, Osler. I wanted to walk you all through what this past season looked like. It is very interesting to be able to watch each crop's response to all of these environmental stressors and how different those responses are, because we do get to be able to see them be planted on the exact same day and respond to the exact same weather. So 2024, most people would remember as being dry, but at the beginning of the season, it was actually pretty wet at first. And so our soybeans and corn were planted on March 25th, and basically the first thing that happened to them was they got flooded a couple of weeks later. And then 2 weeks after this flooding period, we had 2 freezes on April 21st and April 22nd, back to back. And we saw a little bit of stand loss in our soybeans, and but we did have some survival. This also describes why we had 42,000 plants per acre for our soybeans. Flooding and then freezing really knocks down your population. Then with the corn, we did have our first 2 leaves die off, but the amazing thing about corn is that it can recover. And so we have this was taken on May 7th for both crops. We have recovery for soybeans, meaning that not all of them died. And then for corn, we had a couple of leaves die, but corn, the growing point was under the ground still, and it wasn't a heavy enough freeze to kill the growing point below ground. So we just lost a couple of leaves. The only thing that did was really made it kind of difficult to stage, and there's an energy expenditure for the corn, so we might see that reflected in a little bit of our yield for March for our March 25th planted corn. The second planting date really wasn't affected by this because it had just went into the ground. One other interesting thing that we got to see within our beans, we have our March 25th planted and our April 16th planted. Those are our first 2 planting dates. And bean leaf beetle is one of our first insects that comes in the season. We often see it in early season soybeans. But we saw an interesting comparison with our first planting date having much more damage than our second planting date. While they have kind of similar emergence dates, they were a similar stage most of the season. They're pretty close in growth. And these 2 pictures are taken about 3 feet apart. And so we were wondering why we would have so much more damage on the earlier ones rather than them even hopping over 3 feet to start on the brand new growth. So we asked our entomologists why that might be the case. And the insecticidal treatment for these beans only last about 3 weeks. And then the protection kind of goes away. And so what we think happened is that our second planting date still had the protection of that insecticidal treatment, but the first one didn't. And even though they're at a similar stage, they favored the first planting date still. However, that shouldn't be detrimental to yield because we didn't have 30% damage, and that's the amount that you need to really necessitate a insecticidal treatment. So this shouldn't have any yield repercussions from that amount of bean leaf beetle damage that we actually saw. And I'll actually switch it to Laura because this is her favorite.
I know Taylor knows which one is my favorite. I like to talk about soybean flowering. So I already mentioned that a little bit when we think about weed control, but I just want to reiterate as well. Again, when we plant early, you can expect the plants to flower early. So we planted March 25th. They began flowering on May 28th. And when we think about soybean flowering, it is triggered by the longer length in nighttime. And when we plant early, we also have longer nights before and after the summer solstice. And so we think that triggered or induced flowering. And then also we had a higher number of growing degree days last year. If you plant wheat, wheat harvest was about 10 days earlier than normal. So we had more growing degree days in March, April, May. And so those two factors, I think, played a role into that earlier flowering. So if you're planting these soybeans early, just really keep an eye on your flowering date. And it also, I think, sped along corn development as well last year.
So when we look at our stressors, this is the one that we remember the most. Drought conditions for this location began in July, but the map that you see is from September 10th, probably the worst part of the drought period. And that really took a toll. Our planting date 4 in corn died because of lack of water, and planting date 5 actually completely got cut off after the hurricane because it laid down. So we did have a couple of stressors in there that the rest of the state was facing, which also, I think, kind of evened out our soybean yield a little bit more because of those drought conditions.
So Battle for the Belt is really comparing corn and soybeans. So we wanted to do that on a graph. So this graph is showing both corn and soybean yield on the same graph. The blue line is corn, the orange line is soybean. And what we did is we selected the hybrid that had the highest yield. So we assumed Osler would pick out the best hybrid. So we picked it out. So we didn't want to penalize corn because those 110 days or 100 days don't do well with early planting. So we picked the treatment, either the seeding rate for soybean or the hybrid that had the highest yield for this graph. And so what we see is that for corn, when we pick the best hybrid, really the first 3 planting dates yielded the same. That's only because we picked that 115-day hybrid here, but there was a little bit of downtick if you include the other hybrids. For soybeans, statistically, the first 4 planting dates, though, yielded the same. And both crops really yielded poorly when we went out into that mid-June planting date. I'm going to rewind and talk about 2013 because we have 2 years of data. I won't go through the whole growing season, but 2020, I keep saying 2013, don't I? It's very hard for me to remember what year we're in. 2023, last year, had some unique growing conditions as well. So this is the same setup where corn is in blue and soybean is in orange. In 2023, our corn yielded the best at the end of May and into June. So this points out why we have to do research over multiple years because this isn't representative of what we would expect. But in 2023, there were really wet conditions and then a really long dry spell at Western. And so the corn did not do well being planted into those conditions. And there were some strong winds that came through as well. And a lot of the corn fell over because there was poor root growth and it fell over. So what's interesting, though, is soybeans were planted on the exact same day. and the soybeans had the exact same weather conditions, and the soybean said, I don't care. So even though they had really wet conditions and cold and then pivoted to extremely dry and cool, soybean yields were highest when we planted mid-April through about May 11th, where it was the opposite of corn. So I think that's an interesting comparison of the two crops, that if you have early season stress during planting, soybeans can adapt. Even if the plant population is low, they can increase the number of branches, and yield isn't as affected as it is for corn. So our recommendations here at Western Ohio, from the soybean side, the crop insurance date, the early crop insurance date is April 10th for soybeans. If soil conditions are adequate, so if soil moisture allows, planting at that date or around that date, I think is fine. And I'll let Osler talk about his corn recommendations.
What we saw so far at the West Central location past 2 years, we will say we recommend precaution on going on those very early planting dates, especially if we know that there will be some sort of stressors. Like Laura said, it could be very wet. It could then be dry. That really hammered us in 2023. Seeing those atypical results yielding higher with later plantings, which kind of contradicts what we will generally recommend. So yes, precautions on early planting corn is really something that we are learning here. In the other hand, soybeans can really take it. The other thing is relative maturities. At the West Central location, we are south in the state. That also allows the opportunity to maximize corn yields, 200, 250 bushels to the acre with a full season maturity, 115-day hybrid. That's the hybrid that gave us the best results on the early planting dates. And if we are, for whatever reason, planting late, end of May into June, certainly we see a result, we see an improvement, we see the advantage of considering a shorter season hybrid that will hopefully make it to physiological maturity before it gets too cold in the fall. So that's it for this location, and I think this is probably the second favorite slide for Laura. Soybean wins at the Western location based on what we are learning, based on the results that we have seen so far.
It is my favorite slide, and I always like it because I make Osler say it. So not only does it exist, Osler has to declare soybean as the winner. And I think really this is because we had those really early planting dates at the Western location with those early season stressors. And, having those stressful conditions really, it hurts soybean as well. You see those lower plant populations, but the soybean plants can compensate so well compared to corn. So our other location that we're going to talk about, and we'll talk about Worcester as well, is the next one is Northwest. So this is up in Wood County, Ohio. Taylor, what happened in Wood County, Ohio last year?
So last year in Wood County, Ohio, we got a lot of rain, and it rained so much that we got our early planting date on May 16th, which is really disappointing, but it's very real for farmers that most of that area farms also didn't get planted until this time. So it was very wet in May. It was still storming in June. I thought that picture in June was really cool, so I wanted to keep it up. But storms in June, and then I think we had one really good inch of rain in July, and then we had drought conditions after that. And so this location, once we did get planted, saw a lot of stress. So it continued to be kind of flooding conditions until the rain shut off, and we were almost immediately into drought conditions. So these plants really had a rough time getting into the ground and for the rest of the season at this location.
So for soybean yield, first off, I'll point out at the western location, we did have those really low plant populations. At the northwest location, all of our plant populations were over 100,000 plants per acre on average. But again, our first planting date was the middle of May because of that really early season wet condition. So it makes sense our plant populations were much more even since that early date didn't happen at Northwest because of the weather. The first two planting dates yielded statistically the same, so 56, 54 bushels per acre. So that's the middle of May, going towards the end of May. And then our yield reductions really occur when we get into those June planting dates. So those are 46 to 43 bushels per acre going into June.
Alrighty, looking at results for corn, still at the northwest location, we see yields here not as competitive as what we saw at the west central location. Remember, our best yielding hybrids and planting dates, we were 200, 250 bushels. Now we are a solid notch down. We are seeing somewhere between 140, 130 up to maybe close to 200 bushels to the acre, and that has to do with the conditions for the season at the northwest location. As far as planting dates and hybrids, we still see that interaction. We see that depending on the planting dates, we should be looking at the different hybrid relative maturities. Generally speaking, our best planting day results for the northwest location was the second planting date that was in May 23rd. And then that's it. If we were planting before that, we were losing yield. If we were planting after that, we were losing yield. So that was math really spot on, maximizing yields. Now, as far as hybrids, that second planting day was the best, May 23rd. And best hybrids that we see there is, I mean, the 100-day hybrid is yielding almost as good as the 107 and almost as good as the 115. Just remember, we are already in a late planting scenario due to wet conditions early in the season. So it also makes sense that that 100-day hybrid is showing up as one of the top yielding. And as we look to later planting dates down the graph, that 100-day hybrid still is up there fighting the fight against the 115 or in the 111 later in June.
So looking at both crops together, this is 2024. Again, corn is blue and soybeans are that orange color. The highest yielding for corn technically was the same. If we could pick the best hybrid, that 100-day for early planting kind of drove down the average. And then for soybeans, the yield declines are much more subtle. The first two planting dates were the highest yielding, and then a slow decline down, where corn has a little bit of a sharper decline there. We'll rewind back a year. This is 2023, also at the Northwest location. For corn in 2023, the first three planting dates yielded statistically the same, and our early planting date in 2023 was truly an earlier one. This was mid-April at that location. But then once we went to May 11th and beyond, we see a very sharp decline in soybean yield. Soybeans also did well with early planting in 2023. And there was a slight yield reduction as we went into the end of May into June, but that decline in yield was just not as great or as steep as what we saw for corn. So for soybean in Northwest, the early crop insurance date is April 15th. We weren't able to get near that date in 2024 because of the wet conditions, but the year before in 2023, we were able to plant around that date, and yields were statistically the highest there, and similar to the end of April planting date as well. So if soil moisture conditions allow, which I know is always a challenge up in Northwest Ohio, that April 15th date is probably fine, but in some years it'll likely be too wet.
As far as corn for Northwest Ohio, also I mean, in all cases, we need to be looking at crop insurance dates, right? If we want to be protected. Based on our results, we also saw that yield decline that is present on soybeans. If we are delaying planting date for corn, we are losing yield. The 115-day relative maturity was giving consistency, although if we were in the later planting dates, we need to be thinking on those shorter maturities that can give us a better result. We say this from this side of the screen is kind of easy, but we know that in practical terms, it is complicated. We already have the seed. We already have the hybrids. We don't know what the planting season will look like until we are on it. So theoretically speaking, that adjustment of relative maturity is a need, especially if with anticipation, we know that we will be planting later or late. The other thing, the last bullet point there is we need to pay attention to growing degree day. Corn responds really well to growing degree day accumulation. Those are the heat units. And we are, in this case, in the northern part of the state. So we are a lot more constrained to how many days or how much of a season do we have available for that crop. And based on what we are seeing from the past 2 years at the Northwest location, we are calling this a tie. So we are hoping that Taylor will help us this year to solidify a winner at the Northwest location. So 2025 will tell the truth, we hope.
All right, so moving on to our last location, Northeast Ohio. So this is where Worcester campus is located. So Taylor, tell us what it looked like in Worcester last year.
So last year in Worcester, our earliest planting date was April 22nd, and we planted every 2 weeks until our last planting date in June. So we got actually pretty similar dates to what we had in 2023, which is really nice for consistency at this location. But overall, this year was, I don't know, fairly mild compared to the other locations. In Worcester, we saw in the early season, we had some nutrient issues within the corn, not necessarily related to the weather, but we had some zinc deficiency that was a little bit more obvious, especially when the corn was a little bit younger, but eventually it kind of grew out of it a little bit, but a fairly normal weather, pretty mild, not very much drought stress. And then with our beans, we do see these are the same plot just over time. So on the left, we have a younger plot where we do see some of those gaps from our lower populations, but it filled in really, really well. And we see that our soybean plants are compensating for each other. And so pretty normal growth for our soybeans as well. Then eventually, towards the very end of the season, we see some drought come into this location, but it came in September when we're just about done with pod filling anyway. So that was not as big of a stressor for this location as it was in other parts of the state. So overall, a pretty neutral year.
So for soybean yields at the Worcester location, our earliest planting date was about the third week of April or so, and our yield was highest there at 60 bushels per acre, statistically the same as our third planting date in the middle of May at 56 bushels per acre. So high yields were achieved with those earlier planting dates, and then a fairly sharp decline in soybean yield once we go from the middle of May to the end of May and then into June. For plant populations, there were some lower stand issues with our first planting date, and that was in April, 99,000 plants per acre, which is lower than maybe what you'd want to see, but certainly wasn't low enough yet to impact yield.
Looking at corn for the Northeast location, that's where my office is located, Worcester campus. I get to see these plots a lot more often than Western and Northwest. But what we saw in 2024, we are still looking at the 4 relative maturities. We see that on that first planting date, that was April 22nd for Worcester last year, on that first planting date, something to point out, just a misselection of a hybrid can give us a range of 75, 70, 80 bushels losses right off the gate, right? So making that hybrid selection with a good background, a good rationale, and hopefully a solid understanding of what the growing season might look like can give us a very competitive advantage, especially in that extreme case. As far as planting dates, there is still an interaction of relative maturities and the dates when those were planted. The best result that we can see here is for that second planting date that was May 3rd, and also the third planting date that was May 21st in 2024. We see that we are maximizing yield in that window. The best hybrids are, interestingly here, second planting date best hybrid was 115 day. The third planting date best hybrid that we see in the graph is the 100 day. So there is a complete shift right there. Not even looking at 107, 111 as a transition point. Rather, our best is the full season early, and then our best is the shorter season on that next planting date. As we delay planting to the fourth or fifth plantings, we are looking at yield losses there, ending up somewhere in the 150 bushel per acre planting in June versus 200 bushels per acre if we are planting in that optimum window of first half of May approximately.
So for our corn versus soybean comparisons up in Worcester, really the ideal timeframes were really similar in 2024. Both crops did fairly well with the early planting. For corn, this is showing the best hybrid for each planting date. So there's that's the tricky part here because yields can shift quite substantially, it looked like at that location if you had the wrong hybrid. But fairly similar high yielding conditions for those earliest planting dates. Rewinding back 1 year to 2023, again, a very similar graph for both corn and soybean. Early in the season in 2023, both crops did not do very well with early planting, and our early planting date was a little bit earlier that year. It was right around, I think, April 14th or so. We did see low plant populations for soybean in 2023. We're working with plant pathology to look at diseases. And so in 2023, Northeast Ohio had our highest level of diseases. So that probably played a role. And also when Taylor was digging around and looking at her soybean seedlings, she found seed corn maggot. So with earlier planting, there was, I think, some issues similar to that bean leaf beetle issue where we plant too early and it's wet and that seed treatment may not last as long. So in Northeast Ohio on the soybean side, the early planting date for crop insurance is April 15th. Even though it's the same as Northwest Ohio, I'm a little bit more cautious about early planting up in Worcester, only because we've had other planting date research up there as well. And sometimes we can run into trouble with early planting, so that mid-April timeframe up in Worcester. So proceeding with caution a little bit more in that area of the state, I think, is important.
Likewise for corn, as we saw those lines, those side-by-side corn versus soybeans graphics in 23 and 24, both crops have a very comparable recommendation, which in corn we also agree, probably waiting a little bit more into that early May window has been paying off the better results to this point. as we are still in the northern part of the state, growing degree day accumulation and that hybrid selection really makes a difference. So that's one of the first decision steps, and we can clearly see that there are implications either for the better or for the worse. And with that, Worcester location, Lynn, we are calling this a tie, and we look forward to 2025. We already have plot plans out to our farm managers that will help us carry the experiment in this new season. Summarizing the whole 45, 50 minutes of this talk, soybean yields tended to decrease as planting was delayed. We saw that pretty much across the board with some exceptions. Seeding rates for soybeans, we are seeing that anywhere above 100,000 seeds per acre is giving consistently higher yielding results, with the caveat that if plant population is expected to be a concern, pushing to those higher seeding rates can have a positive impact at the end of the race. In terms of corn, I have said multiple times, corn seems to be more finicky. The planting day trends were a little bit less consistent relative to soybeans. In general, mid-April to mid-May window was roughly optimal for corn plantings, almost across the different occasions and the different years. So that seems to be the safe spot. Longer relative maturities, if we are able to plant early, that will help us to maximize yield. If we are planting later, we ought to be looking at shorter maturities. And the last bullet point there on the screen on red is that if we need, based on the 2 years of results that we have to this point, if we needed to prioritize one crop for those very early plantings or prioritizing one crop that can be penalized with the later plantings, we are seeing that soybeans can take that better. Corn seems to like more the sweet spot planting. Soybeans can take bad conditions early and soybeans can take bad conditions late. And a lot of that relates to plant plasticity. Soybeans will put branches and fill up more pods as a way to compensate for lower plant populations or as a response to stress. In the case of corn, we don't have that capacity. So if we have lower plant stands, we are losing ears that we will be harvesting at the end of the season. In case you haven't, all of our research and extension updates out of this project, Battle for the Belt, they go out through the corn newsletter. There is a QR code for that. There is a OSU Agronomy YouTube channel that Stephanie linked earlier on the chat. And also Laura and myself and Taylor, we try to put things on our Twitter now X accounts when we can, as far as our research updates. As you might imagine, this effort takes on a small village. All three of us, we are just the face presenting the work. However, there are several institutions, entities, and individuals that have been critical in order to get this kind of work done. Imagine 5 times a planter out of the shop at each of those research stations, and then think about nitrogen in the case of corn, think about other practices. So it's really a massive effort. We are thankful to our farm managers. We are thankful to USDA for some of the funding, Ohio Soybean Council, Ohio Corn and Wheat, and we have also support from internal support from the college. And that's all we got. Stay tuned for more research updates. 2025 is the last year of the project. That's what we are anticipating. That will give us 3 full years, 3 different occasions. That's a combination of 9 different environments. So that will hopefully allow us to make some recommendations for Ohio moving forward. The the exciting new opportunity that is spinning out of this Battle for the Belt work. In 2025, we are launching a new project that is looking into replanting decision thresholds. We always get questions about replanting decisions. There are some thresholds that were developed back in the day. So stay tuned for that. 2025 and the next 2026, we will be doing replanting decisions work here in Ohio through a new project that spin off out of Battle for the Belt. And with that, I will turn it over to Taylor to wrap us up as far as service. Thank you.
Thank you all for your attention and participating with us today. And again, thank you for everybody who filled out our first survey. It's really helpful for us in improving extension. And I dropped the post survey in the chat. The first question is asking for your name, and I wanted to explain as well. That is just so I can connect the pre and post surveys, so you don't have to fill out demographics all over again. It's kind of a waste. So that way we can connect those, and then after we summarize them, we'll leave your name off. But thank you all for your help. And also, I think we're open for questions if you have any questions.
Yeah, thanks, Taylor. If you do have questions for Laura, Osler, or Taylor, please put those in the Q&A function on the Zoom bar down below, and that way we can get your questions. They'll be able to answer them live. And we do appreciate everyone to complete that post-test survey. Just again, it helps to further our research and to know what we've done and things like that. I do know as Laura, Osler, and Taylor, when they started this project, I got a chance to have some conversations with farmers. Asking which one do they plant first, and I can remember the one farmer's response, well, if I have enough employees and labor, I'm going to do both of them at the same time. But we know we all don't have that fortunate ability to find some of that labor, and so we do have to answer that question. Which one do we start? So we greatly appreciate the work that you guys have done, and greatly thank the sponsors of the project, the USDA NIFA grant, Ohio Soybean Council, Ohio Corn and Wheat, and all of our research farms and everything they've done.